So as we're talking about the 1920s, one of the things we do need to talk about is the social tension that is rising because of some competing economic/social ideals. And those three ideals are communism, anarchism, and capitalism. Now, you might be a little bit familiar with some of these ideas, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into all three of them so that you can understand why there's some social tension going on. The first kind of big vocab of the 1920s that we need to mention is something called the Red Scare. So the Red Scare is the fear or paranoia of communism. Red always seems to be attached to communism, and so we are literally afraid that that communism is going to spread and take over. Now, there are some countries at this time that are communist. Russia is one that we will talk about a little bit later, but that is a real fear that we're having in our country, is that we are going to be turned communist because of rising and spreading communism around the world. This is honestly a fear that's going to last for a while. We see its first little bubble happen right after World War I, but we'll see an even larger wave of this after World War II. Now, let's get into those three different ideals that are going to be in competition with each other. So, our first one, which is one that you probably know the most about, is capitalism. Capitalism is an economic idea that people and companies can own stuff. What we would, in technical terms, call the means of production. What you can use to produce things. So anyone can own a business, and businesses compete with each other to make the most money. During the 1920s, the American government is very pro-business. They want to let the businesses grow and do what the businesses do. They don't want to interfere because businesses are making a whole lot of money. So they're just letting that continue to happen without really regulating too much or trying to get really involved at all. This is what we're really familiar with because America's economic system is very heavily based on capitalism. Now, our second big idea that's going to lead to a lot of that social tension is communism. Communism is another economic ideal that the government or community should own the means of production so that it can be equally distributed between everybody. So it's really banking on everyone being willing to pull their own weight and share everything equally. After the business boom that's happened in our country, we have haves and have-nots. We have super, super rich people like our Rockefellers and our Carnegies, but we also have people who are dirt poor, living on the street, do not have any money at all. So some of those people who are at the lower end of that economic stratosphere are going to turn towards communism because they believe that's a better way to close the gap between how poor they are and how rich the richest people in our society is. Now, there is a third idea here that we need to mention that we're also very afraid of during this time, so that's why I'm mentioning it, and that is anarchism. We tend to think of anarchism as being just craziness and everyone does what they want to do. But it's also seen as far left extremism, like communism goes 2 steps too far and turns into complete and total anarchy. But anarchism is an actual belief, an actual form of government and economics that some people support, that believe that governing and laws in general is just harmful, and that people should be able to come together on their own and make decisions instead of being forced into that by the government. So someone who would label themselves as an anarchist doesn't like hierarchies, doesn't like bureaucracy, doesn't like government. They just think that we as people should be able to come together and sort ourselves out. Now, this is another part of the Red Scare. So we're afraid of communism, we're afraid of anarchism, we're just kind of afraid of both of these things, and we're afraid of it spreading. So we kind of see that start to permeate culture a little bit. So this first political cartoon on the screen, you can see this little guy, he's got a knife and a bomb coming after the Statue of Liberty, which is supposed to represent our country, but on him it says European anarchist. So, like, that is something we're literally afraid of. Now, one of the other things that very frequently anarchism ends up being connected to are our labor unions. So, because labor unions are fighting against the business owners, because they want better pay or better hours or better working conditions, we often see them as being anti-capitalist. It's not that they're really anti-capitalist, they just feel like their businesses should be looking out for them a little bit better. But because the labor unions are pushing against those businesses, we see that labor kind of can connect to that chaos that we normally connect to anarchism. Okay? Now, this paranoia or Red Scare is going to spread across the country. So it's not just centralized. It's not just happening in like Washington, D.C. It is happening across our country that people are very afraid of communism, of anarchism, of anything that looks like that, because we are a country built on capitalism and individualism and private property and having competition in business. So we're very afraid that all of those things are slowly going to go away if communism in any kind of form reaches its way into our society. Now, the other thing that we're also afraid of that connects with this is the idea of government controlling everything, which with communism, the idea that either the government or society as a whole is controlling everything, we're afraid that if government has too much control, that it will lead us towards communism. So that is another thing that we are also afraid of. Now, a lot of people normally ask me, well, why are we afraid of all this? And the biggest thing actually comes down to Russia. So in the middle of World War I, Russia has a revolution. So it's called the Russian Revolution. So in 1917, Russia actually leaves World War I due to this. They're so preoccupied with the fact that there's a revolution going on, they can't keep fighting World War I. So this is a very bloody revolution that happens. A group known as the Bolsheviks are going to take charge of Russia and completely turn it communist. Russia has a lot of influence. It's a rather large country in Europe. So they have influence over other countries that are nearby. So we're slowly going to start to see some of those communist ideas spreading to Southern and Eastern Europe. Now, if you remember back a couple units, where are most of the immigrants coming from at this time to the United States? Southern and Eastern Europe. So these countries that we're seeing communist kind of ideas spreading, those people are coming to our country. So we're afraid that because we have these new people coming to our country, that it's going to lead to a spread of communism. Now, the goal for Russia, now that it is communist, their self-proclaimed goal that they're like openly sharing, is to overthrow capitalism. So that's going to add even more to our fears of communism, because we feel like their goal is to overthrow the system that we've had in our country since we were created. Now, one of the other reasons why we are fearful is because there actually is a communist party in the United States at this time. So there is a communist political party. It's actually established in 1919, so right at the end of World War I, and they actually have tens of thousands of members in the United States. Now, communism and socialism are really closely tied together. We'll talk more about that right after we get through World War II. But you can see that both of these things are happening in our own country at this time. We have both a communist party and a socialist party. So obviously from this, you can see that fear of communism, because of a communist and socialist presence in our country is going to continue through the 20th century and is obviously leading to a lot of social issues.